Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me today is our newest addition to the clan, Arie DeYoung. Arie, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing very good, and thank you for having me on your podcast. How are you doing yourself?
I'm hanging in there pretty well, and I'm pleased to be able to say this is now our podcast. Since you're now part of the group here, congratulations. You're the exact kind of emerging voice we like to feature at Emerging Civil War. So great to have you with us, man. So, tell us a little bit. I'm always fascinated in people's Civil War origin stories. Like, what got you hooked in the Civil War in the first place?
Well, for maybe a bit interestingly, I was originally actually interested in the Revolutionary War when I first got interested in history, and I still am. But the very interesting thing about that is the Revolutionary War begins American history, but the Civil War resolves a lot of the conflicts that the American Revolution left open in terms of the questions like slavery, the relationship between state and federal government. So as I kind of got interested in the American Revolution, you find yourself wondering how are these great themes throughout American history going to be resolved, and that all naturally kind of pushes you over to the American Civil War, which is my current area of interest.
I've always kind of wondered if the founders knew that the Civil War was going to happen and what the results turned out to be. I wonder what sort of choices they would have made differently, if any. Um, but we sort of get the benefit of knowing, like, kicking this can down the road doesn't work out so well.
Yes.
So I don't know. Have you given that thought?
I mean, it's always interesting to look at these questions with the 2020 hindsight.
Uh,
And at the time, you do have founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson who described the compromise of slavery as holding the wolf by the ears. So then you have to wonder, to some sense, they knew that they were making a risk by making a compromise, but
uh,
at the same time, they probably figured these compromises were necessary, that they couldn't figure out any other way in their own time to address the conflicts, that they were so resolutely in favor. There are some founders that are so resolutely in favor of continuing the slave system that they just had to be compromised with. And we could argue, was that the right moral choice? Was that the right ethical choice? But for the founders, it was certainly the right political choice.
uh, yeah, I mean, to me, it's like a monumental decision to have to make, and I'm glad that I wasn't there having to make it. Like, you know,
Certainly.
do you set the slavery issue aside for the to be able to hold the glue together, or do you say, like, well, maybe holding the glue together isn't quite so worth it, because we have this large moral or ethical issue. So yeah, tough conundrum for those guys. So and now with the 250th coming up, we're getting to sort of have a good opportunity to look back at those sorts of decisions and what lessons we can pull from them. Um, do you have a particular spot you've gone that really lit your fire about the Civil War? A favorite battlefield or historic site, anything like that?
Uh, I particularly enjoyed Chickamauga, and I suspect that probably has to do with my interest in the Army of the Cumberland and George Thomas. They're my kind of military area of focus in the American Civil War. But just standing in Snodgrass Hill, you're really able to visualize a battle. Because whenever you go to a battlefield, at least for me, you kind of imagine what all the soldiers all those years ago were thinking what it would be like for them to see lines of enemies advancing. And it was probably the most visceral for me, in my opinion,
Yeah.
just standing on Snodgrass Hill, because it's a very well preserved battlefield. And you can just, you're standing on a height, so you can see a lot around you. And you just think, what would it have been like to have been a Union soldier in, say, Harker's brigade, Charles G. Harker's brigade, and trying to defend that position. The rest of two of the Union Army corps commanders have fled. The Army commander have fled. Only you and your scattered regiments and brigades are trying to hold this crucial position. And what that sort of existential feeling would have felt like for those men.
Yeah, being in that hot seat in that moment, what a crisis, and to be right there. Wow. So what got you, what turned you into a Thomas guy? What turned you into an Army of Cumberland guy?
Uh, I have just always enjoyed the underdog stories, and always enjoyed kind of trying to find the maybe unsung heroes in conflicts. And I feel that nowadays George Thomas is getting a fair amount of credit, a fair amount of recognition. But George Thomas is always he doesn't get the same amount of recognition even nowadays, even with his improving reputation as, say, a Grant or a Sherman.
Yeah.
So, but I still I find it very interesting for all of his accomplishments to just look at his record and see how well he could have done for the Union. Consider how well he could have done for the Union if he had been given more opportunities. But I'll enters into the hypotheticals.
Yeah, yeah, and and I think he probably also suffers a little bit of a bum rap. Well, of course, because of his relationship with Schofield, who tends to do a lot of rewriting of history afterwards. And people, I think, make a big to do about his relationship with Grant, or make a bigger to do about it than it is. Maybe trying to read into some animosity that probably wasn't there, but everyone
Right.
likes high school drama, right? Yeah. So, um, I wanted to bring you on today because you've been doing some research about the state of Indiana for your thesis, and so I thought, well, let's talk about the 5 things we need to know about Indiana in the Civil War because you seem to be pretty up to speed. So I've asked you to kind of come up with 5 cool things that we should talk about. So that's going to be the main theme of our podcast today. And let's start from number 5 and we'll work our way up to number 1. When you gave thought to this idea, did you put them in like a ranking or you just kind of got 5 stories for us?
I just kind of imagine them as 5 stories, but I think I can probably tell them sequentially
Okay. All right. Very
for
good. Well,
the
hit us with number 5.
well, the first story I would probably focus on would be Oliver P. Moore and the War Governor. He, of course, was very representative of the Republican Party as it was being formed throughout the 1850s, as he originally started as a Free Soil Democrat. And like many at the time, the Democratic Party was a bit divided during the 1840s, entering into the 1850s, with the pro-slavery and free soiler factions. And eventually, around the time of the Pierce presidency, the Free Soilers started being ejected from the party, and Oliver P. Morton was very much one of those people to be removed. In his particular case, it was instigated by Senator Jesse D. Bright of Indiana, who is another figure who has a very interesting Civil War story during Indiana during another very interesting Indiana Civil War story. But once Oliver P. Morton was removed from the Democratic Party, he still wanted to continue his political career and continue his anti-slavery advocacy. So he helped to found the People's Party of Indiana, which would become the forerunner of the Indiana Republican Party. In the 1854 elections, they helped to put, I believe, 9 members of their People's Party into the House of Representatives. And then in 1856, Oliver P. Morton made his first run for the governor's candidate against, I believe it's Governor Willard that he ran against and ultimately lost against by a narrow margin. So come 1860, he was very interested in continuing the run for office, but they made a very interesting compromise in the Indiana Republican Party at the time, as the People's Party had become subsumed within the larger national organization. They put Henry S. Lane, who was a very respected Whig politician, as the top of the ticket, the governor's candidate, and they made Oliver P. Morton the lieutenant governor's candidate. And this might be a bit surprising that Morton would take what would seem to be a demotion after having previously been the governor's candidate in 1856. But what the plan was that Henry Lane would carry the ticket to victory in the 1860 gubernatorial election, and assuming the state legislature was also carried, and he'd be sent to the Senate, and then Oliver P. Morton would rise from lieutenant governor to full governor. And
So they had this all worked out then, huh?
yeah, so that's exactly what happened, and it proved to be very fortuitous for Indiana because it got an experienced senator who helped Lincoln in Washington D.C., while Governor Morton provided the steady hand to guide the state throughout the Civil War.
So how do you rate Morton as far as like his effectiveness as a governor? Do you like him? Do you not like him? Does he do what he does he pull through for the Republicans?
He was undoubtedly very effective. Now, that certainly brought along with it a certain amount of controversy. Some, especially, questioned his methods, and even well, it would be very plausible to even call him a dictator, considering some of the methods he implied, dismissing the state legislature and trying to run Indiana via loans from banks. But ultimately, it was a very dangerous time for the state and a very dangerous time for the union. And undoubtedly, he did have the union's best interests in mind. and he was very popular among the soldiers for the amount of support and aid he had provided them throughout the war. So there's very much two sides to Oliver P. Morton. Two sides. One side saying, well, he acted in very controversial, very uh, perhaps even dictatorial methods, but he also acted very decisively. He pulled through for the Union in a time when it desperately needed it, and he provided strong leadership for a hotly divided state.
And I was going to say, and I'm hoping I'm not jumping ahead to a later number on your rankings here, but I was going to say, like, a strong personality for Indiana seems to be really important because Indiana is a pretty different state as you go from north to south. It's
Yes.
almost like two or three different states rolled into one. How would you characterize Indiana?
Indiana, well, to borrow Abraham Lincoln's phrase, it was very much a house divided against itself.
Yeah.
It had very some portions of the state, like the fifth district, which I'll get into a bit more later, the burnt district, was very deeply anti-slavery, not just pro-Republican, but anti-slavery. But more towards the southern end of the state, uh, they had some people who weren't just Democrats, but perhaps even Copperhead Democrats, where they were very at least comfortable with slavery, if not necessarily pro-slavery, but they also were willing to compromise and even perhaps allow the existence of the Confederacy if it meant peace for
Mhm.
the state.
And certainly being down there along the river where they have slavery right across the border, um, pretty used to it. And southern Indiana is pretty southern, quote unquote,
Yes.
as opposed to northern Indiana. So, I mean, that's just a really different flavor mix. So, Morton, with his strong personality, is able to kind of wrangle the cats in a way that maybe a lesser person might not be able to.
Yeah. So after the war, he played a pretty large part in getting Abraham Lincoln reelected. He helped in all of the electioneering during that time. And by the end of the conflict, the question became for him how his political career would continue because at the time Indiana had one-term limits on their governors, and he slightly, you could say, tried to weasel his way through the rules because he argued that since he didn't serve the full gubernatorial term since Henry Lane from earlier had served a couple of days, he argued I should be allowed to run again, and he did in 1864.
Okay.
But he knew that he wouldn't be able to pull the same trick in 1868. He had to find a new office for himself.
Yeah.
So in
I
18,
mean, oh, go ahead.
so in 1866, he ran for Senate, and that's where he would serve the rest of his life. He would enter in 1867 and serve in the Senate until 1877.
Okay. So I mean, that was sort of the rationale Teddy Roosevelt used when he ran for reelection. It's like I came in during McKinley's first term, so I didn't really get a full first term. Yeah, but
Yeah.
uh, uh, so how successful or how different was Morton's Senate career versus his gubernatorial career? Is he the same kind of politician? Does he have to operate differently in Washington?
He actually undergoes a very interesting transformation from his gubernatorial career into his senatorial career. In part, like I mentioned, he was a Democrat who eventually became a Republican. So that brought with it certain moderate tendencies that really shone through during his gubernatorial tenure. I might get into this later if another thing down the list,
Sure.
but he was the head of the moderate faction of the Indiana Republican Party during this war. But come 1866, and during the height of radical Reconstruction, he was faced with a conundrum in that the party was pulling one way, so he had to go along the tide or get swept out to sea by it. And
Okay.
he ultimately chose to go along with the tide.
Yeah, yeah.
He,
Interesting metaphor for landlocked Indiana being
in,
caught up in the tides.
yes, maybe like Michigan for him.
Yeah, see, there you go. So, anything else about number five that we need to know about Oliver P. Morton? Fascinating character, well worth folks taking a look at.
Certainly, he's perhaps the most interesting governor of the war, in my opinion.
Ooh, that's a bold statement because there are some colorful characters who served as governor during the war. So you say Morton's the most interesting. Mhm.
there's a strong case to be made for it, I would say.
Okay, all right, all right, all right. Well, hopefully, if folks are listening along, they want to put their comments in below to let us know what they think about that, because I'm sure some folks have some strong feelings there. So, all right, so let's move on to number four. What's the next thing we need to know about Indiana during the Civil War?
So moving now into 1861, I thought the next thing we could talk about could be the 19th Indiana Infantry Regiment,
Ah,
which became famous as a member of the Iron Brigade. They were one of the early war regiments, the Russia Volunteers, and they were organized in Indiana and originally commanded by Solomon Meredith. And they, unlike most Indiana regiments, were actually sent to the Eastern Theater to fight, and that's how they got part to, and that's how they became part of the Iron Brigade. And they had a very interesting Eastern Theater career. They obviously distinguished themselves in battle, but off the battlefield, they could be a bit difficult for their commanders. Notoriously, one of their brigade commanders, John Gibbon, was a bit of a disciplinarian and insisted on a pretty strict dress code, including a type of stocking for his soldiers. And the members of the Iron Brigade thought this was a bit fussy for their Midwestern sensibilities. So one day, when John Gibbon went off to perform some duties separate from his camp, and when he came back, he found that his horse had on the stockings that his soldiers are supposed to wear. But in spite of this bit of a rebellious nature, the Iron Brigade did prove themselves over the course of the war, especially the 19th Indiana at Bronner's Farm, at Fredericksburg, and at Gettysburg. They all put in distinguished service. At Bronner's Farm, Meredith would receive his first injury, and at Gettysburg, he would be knocked from his horse and have his some of his ribs shattered, which would end his time with the regiment. And the regiment itself was arguably irreversibly damaged by their time at Gettysburg. It lost perhaps the heart of the regiment. They would continue their war service into the Overland Campaign. But by the time of the siege of Petersburg, the original core of the regiment, the men, had been so worn down that the officers who oversaw the Army of Potomac believed it would be better to combine them into the 20th Indiana, merge the two regiments, and ultimately the 20th Indiana got to keep the name, and the 19th Indiana was simply folded into it, ending the career of a very great Civil War regiment.
yeah. How do they get along with their? I mean, I got a bunch of questions here, but how do they get along with the 20th when they got consolidated? Because I know other units in both armies when they got consolidated, there were some hurt feelings.
There was certainly some very tense feelings on the part of the 19th Indiana. They had fought under they had fought under the 19th Indiana flag. That's how they had won all their war honors. That's how they won all their war glory. And to be simply folded into the 20th Indiana, which hadn't even been part of the Iron Brigade, it seemed like a bit of a negation of their whole identity. But
Hmm.
ultimately, they did stick. Many of the soldiers did stick it out. Many of them did reenlist a bit earlier, I believe. So there was certainly some hurt feelings, but ultimately they pulled through for the sake of the Union.
So now I have a connection with the 19th Indiana because uh, my wife owns property at Spotsylvania, the Stevenson Ridge, which we have our emerging Civil War symposium at, and the Iron Brigade was actually stationed at Stevenson Ridge for the second half of the Battle of Spotsylvania. So those Hoosiers got to enjoy some great Stevenson Ridge hospitality while they were in town. Um, how did they get along with the rest of the Iron Brigade? Because it's a, like, although they're Westerners, Indianans are a little different than Wisconsinites, for instance, and so it's kind of an interesting mix in the Iron Brigade. How do they work with those other units?
Yes, all the Iron Brigade regiments, they were all very sturdy, very strong regiments, but they fostered a sense of competition with each other.
Hmm.
And especially, I would say probably this competition was probably made stronger by the fact that it was, like you mentioned, different states. There was Wisconsin and Michigan regiments as well. So they all would argue, oh, at this battle, we had saved you from being, I don't know, broken or routed by the Confederates. But then they would say, oh, no, no. At this battle, we actually had saved you from being broken or routed by the Confederates. So I wouldn't say it was a hostile relationship, but certainly a very competitive one between those regiments.
Yeah, yeah, and you know. They certainly earn their fame on several different battlefields. By the time they come here to the Fredericksburg area in 1864, they're a bit diminished. What would you say what would you characterize as their greatest moment, their greatest success over the course of the war?
I would probably ascribe it to, well, there's a couple of things, but maybe I'd probably put maybe their greatest moment, and maybe referring to this in the sense of iconic, would be Gettysburg. Of course, everyone remembers the Iron Brigade on the first day, John Reynolds behind them, moving into the northeast, I mean the northwest of the town of Gettysburg, trying to drive the Confederates out. And of course, ultimately, that day would be a bit catastrophic for them in the end. They would lose their colonel, they would be driven back through the town, and they'd lose a large portion of their men. But it also would probably be their most famous day and their, what many would probably argue, their greatest day.
Yeah, yeah. When they get here to the wilderness, they have a couple really rough days in the wilderness. They have a couple rough days at the start of Spotsy. Then they get kind of a week off when they're at the Eastern Front. Then they go down to the North Anna River and have a terrible day. You know, I feel bad for the Iron Brigade in the 19th Indiana, particularly over the course of that terrible stretch. So by the time they do get consolidated in the 20th, I mean, they have seen some really serious, hard fighting. And like catastrophic fighting on several different occasions. When the veterans look back at this, and I don't want to put you on the spot if you haven't had the chance to dive into too far, but when they look back on their service, what's the one thing that maybe stands out that as they reflect on, gosh, yes, we were a part of the Iron Brigade.
I haven't done too much research into the post-war
Mhm.
memory of the Iron Brigade, particularly the 19th Indiana. But I know that probably the Battle of Gettysburg, from what
Mm.
I have seen, is probably what they most remembered their service for.
Yeah, I'll give a little pinch hit to our friend Lance Hertigan, who's done some great stuff on the Iron
Yes.
Brigade in memory and looking at kind of those veteran recollections. So I'll point folks in that direction. But I didn't know if you had the chance to read it up on any of that stuff. And I'll fess up that I haven't either. So I, again, don't want to sound like I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah,
So
his book is on my reading list, but I
yeah,
haven't like managed to get my time onto it yet.
it's great stuff. It's really great stuff. So how about number three on our list? What's the third thing that we need to know?
So moving into 1862, I chose the Newburgh Raid, which was one of Indiana's two battles, some would say, during the Civil War. And what occurred here was as part of the Confederate, what will eventually become the Perryville campaign, this Confederate commander named Adam Johnson led 35 men across the Ohio River into southern Indiana, and he was trying to act as a bit of a distraction, trying to raise a bit of chaos in the Union rear as they're trying to hurry back to Kentucky. And what he came to do was he heard reports of Union supplies in the town of Newburgh. So he led his 35 men up to the outside of the town, but he came up with a bit of a clever idea to capture the town. He knew that he was outnumbered. The Indiana Legion, some companies of it had been stationed in the town, and he needed to find some way to convince them to surrender, especially since there were even more companies in the vicinity. So he needed them to surrender quickly. So what he did was he got his hand onto two stovepipes, like very pretty large stovepipes, and he got his hand onto some cannon wheels, and he made what became known as Quaker guns. He put the stovepipes onto the cannon wheels, placed them on the hill outside of the town of Newburgh, and then rushed into the town with his 35 fellow raiders. And he found that the Legion actually had not been prepared for his attack. So when he managed to find the Union commander, he roused him from uh, I believe he was sleeping. He roused the Union commander, and he said, "I'm gonna need you to surrender. I'm gonna take your supplies." And the Union commander, uh, as soon as he saw those Quaker guns up on the hills, he said, "Oh, we don't want any part of this. We don't want to," because he is the Union commander fought at Adam Johnson's instigation, that there are even more Confederates to come soon, and that if he tried to resist, the town would be blown to smithereens. So he agreed to surrender, and Adam Johnson got the supplies he needed, the sabers and rifles and ammunition, and managed to hurry back across the Ohio River and get back to the safety of Confederate camps before the Indiana Legion managed to exact their revenge on him. And from then on, Adam Johnson was known as Adam Stovepipe Johnson for how he had made those Quaker guns.
Small world. My aunt used to live in Newburgh, and she'd tell me when they have Civil War days there every year, they sort of commemorated this little small action. Beautiful little town. I don't know if you've ever been there, but a beautiful little town right on the river. Really quaint. But apparently, it saw a lot of riverboat action through there, so it was a pretty wealthy town in its day back then. So really neat. So this is one of those great stories of Civil War trickery, eh?
Yes,
Yeah.
it seems to go along with the raider trade. Those raiders always seem to be trying to pull one sleight of hand or another, but this one was a particularly clever trick.
Stovepipe Johnson. So I don't know. It's in the fine tradition of Stonewall Jackson, Stovepipe Johnson. So
Yes.
anything we need to know about him and the rest of his career?
Well, he would ultimately be folded into John H. Morgan's command, and he would accompany Morgan onto his uh, later raid into the north, which I'll actually be addressed very soon. But he accompanied him into his raid, and eventually he did manage to get back to Confederate lines. But in 1864, he was blinded by a battlefield injury and not to be captured. But in the post-war era, he did not let his disability prevent him from helping to found a town and becoming a very prominent citizen within it and living a nice long life after the close of the American Civil War.
Is that like Stovepipe, Indiana, or something? Is that?
Yeah, I can't recall the town's name off the top of my head, but I believe it was in Kentucky.
Okay, all right. So what's number two? Now we're working our way up. We're up to number two. This
So moving into 1863 and kind of along in the same vein, we move on to John Hunt Morgan, and uh, the the Battle of Corydon, Indiana's other Civil War
okay.
engagement. So, as part of Braxton Bragg trying to relieve pressure, once again doing another campaign, this one the Tullahoma campaign, John Hunt Morgan would be sent north to engage in some raiding. And originally, this was intended just to be another similar thing to what happened with Newburgh, just a brief little raid up into the north, maybe get some supplies, maybe capture some Union soldiers, just raise chaos, but don't get captured. But John Hunt Morgan, being the dashing cavalier he imagined himself to be, had a bit of a different idea of what he was going to do. So he cut into Indiana just like Adam Johnson did, but instead of going on a short little raid, he keeps pushing north until eventually he reaches the town of Corydon. And in this time, the Indiana Legion was a bit more prepared to face him. They had managed to gather about 400 soldiers and fortify the town. But in this time, the Confederates were not outnumbered. They had brought about 1,400 raiders along with them on this journey. So the Union fortified the south of the town, and the Confederate raiders tried to break against their entrenchments. They launched some charges, which were ultimately repulsed. But since they had a numerical advantage, they were able to sweep around the sides of the town, forcing the Union forces to retreat and ultimately be captured. But in the short term, this was a nice little press victory for John Hunt Morgan. He managed to capture some supplies, capture some Union soldiers, raise chaos throughout the North. But rather than turning around, as he probably should have, he would ultimately continue his journey, his raid into the North, going all the way actually into Ohio before ultimately he was captured by Union forces, ending the raiding career of John Hunt Morgan.
So where in Indiana is Corden? Just if because I'm not that familiar with the state's geography.
It's in the southern half of the state. I believe it's
Okay.
more towards the eastern half.
Okay. All
But
right. That makes
yes,
sense considering the Morgan's eventual path and stuff. So how would you rate the overall impact of the Battle of Corden on um, Morgan's raid?
it was certainly perhaps a very inspirational victory for Morgan and his Raiders, even though they had suffered some casualties, a bit more than they planned. It did prove to them that, oh, there's a big bounty in the north, and if we're going to go and grab it, we can seize it if we just have the courage. But this wasn't necessarily a right mentality for him to be bringing, because he was just his purpose, his orders were simply just to cause chaos, but he believed that he could raise a whole lot more disaster up in the north, which he ultimately did get into Ohio, but it ultimately meant his whole command got shattered. So it
Right.
wasn't necessarily very much worth the trade for what he was trying to do.
Right. I've cheated. I've looked up on my phone where Corydon is. So if you were in Louisville, Kentucky, and continued going west on I-64, you'd run into Corydon along the road there. So
Yeah.
I had to cheat and find out. um, so, and a lot of people don't think about like Civil War battles being in a place like Indiana,
Yes.
because oh gosh, it's Gettysburg or it's Antietam, but otherwise, there is not a whole lot of invasions north. But this is, I think, both of these, Newburgh and Corden, are great illustrations of, that 10,000 places where the Civil War was fought, and
Yes. Yeah.
certainly had a big impact on both of those communities when the war finally does show up on their doorsteps.
Yeah. Very interestingly, when John Hunt Morgan captured the town of Corydon, he came across a newspaper. And since the Battle of Corydon happened on, I believe it was July 9th, 1863, either that or the 18th, he had, yeah, July 9th, he had come across a newspaper that was announcing the Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. And this caused a distraught. It made him a bit distraught, even in light of his victory, and perhaps that also contributed to him making the rather foolhardy decision to continue his raid. But
Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, he's someone who's wanting the headlines himself, and then to have the headlines filled with this awful news for the Confederacy on both fronts. Um, it's interesting that you raised that point that this, is maybe one of those things that kind of pokes him in his pride in a way that makes him make some rash decisions after that. So, interesting, interesting. So I think we're up to the one most important thing we need to know about Indiana. But before we get there, I'm going to toss in one little bonus thing that I don't know much about Indiana in the Civil War, which is why I asked you to come here and talk about it. But the 27th Indiana, which is the regiment that found the lost order, Lee Special Order 191, at the Battle of Antietam. It's one of the very few regimental markers that they have here on the battlefields in the Fredericksburg area. There's a monument to that regiment here at Chancellorsville. If you are kind of going from Hazel Grove and taking the driving tour down out to Fairview, there's this lone monument that stands up off the side of the road, kind of on the edge of the woods like a sentinel, with flank markers in Gettysburg style and everything. And that's the 27th Indiana. So we get to have some Hoosiers here in my own backyard, which is kind of cool. So, all right, so we're up to your number one, Ari. What is it?
yes. And for the final topic I chose, I saved my own research project for last, so I
Very
probably have the
good.
most to say about it. But moving into 1864, we have the 1864 primary election for Indiana's 5th congressional district, which has a very long and very interesting story to it. The incumbent was George W. Julian, one of the more famous representatives, one of the more famous members of the House. He was noted as one of the radical Republicans and certainly the radical Republican in Indiana. So this brought him into conflict with Oliver P. Morton, who, as I mentioned, was the head of the moderates in Indiana. So throughout the Civil War, Oliver P. Morton, to try and consolidate his power, he tried to drive George W. Julian out of office. He tried to recruit a primary challenger in 1862. He couldn't really find anyone strong enough. So George Julian managed to get reelected. But in 1864, Oliver P. Morton thought he had found his trump card. And going back to the 19th Indiana, that trump card was Solomon Meredith, the former commander. Solomon Meredith had been left without a command due to his injuries, and he was always a bit of a political creature. He had been a member of the Indiana state legislature before the Civil War, and was a very close ally to Oliver P. Morton. So when Morton tried to recruit him for a bid for office, he was overjoyed to try and take it on, especially since he had a personal hatred against George
Mm,
Julian going back to the very beginning of the war, because Solomon Meredith was under the impression that some of his problems getting the 19th Indiana all organized and fully recruited was to blame for George W. Julian. And of course, there's also the moderate versus radical tensions going on there.
Right.
So the Indiana primary was set to be done on April 4th. So starting from January when Solomon Meredith launched his campaign through January, February, March, April, the two candidates would just attack each other very aggressively in the press. Meredith's campaign was primarily headed by the Richmond Palladium, as edited by David P. Holloway, and Julian's campaign was primarily run by the Indiana True Republican, as edited by George Julian's own brother, Isaac Julian.
Okay.
So the two competitors would fiercely attack each other, and they very much defined this in the sense that this was a battle for the soul of the Republican Party, because at this time, the party at large was going through the same divisions. The Civil War was winding towards its close. Reconstruction had actually begun in some southern states. So the question was, how would the Republican Party handle this issue? And George Julian stuck his claim very solidly in the radical camp. So the moderates had to find their champion to try to take down the radical champion. And the way that the moderates and radicals tried to define themselves as the true members of the Republican Party was to actually attach themselves to Abraham Lincoln. At least that's what they tried to do in Indiana's 5th District. Both Solomon Meredith and George W. Julian would have their names printed right beside Abraham Lincoln as the Republican ticket for Indiana's 5th Congressional District. They both tried to claim that they were his true candidate. George W. Julian, to attack Meredith, would say, well, back in 1862, you supported McClellan and you did not want him removed from command. And look who is heading towards likely being the Democratic nominee in 1864.
Yeah, okay.
In turn, Meredith would say to Julian, well, what about the Pomeroy circular that's going around? Why is your name attached to this campaign to try and remove Abraham Lincoln as the Republican nominee and replace him with Solomon P. Chase? Yeah. To the point where the Richmond Palladium would literally publish an excerpt from the executive committee of the Chase Central Executive Committee, that showed George W. Julian's name after George Julian had denied he was a member, and essentially said, you said you weren't a member, but why is your name here? So then George Julian said, I actually was added unintentionally. I never personally agreed to sign on to this. They just added my name because they knew I'm a radical Republican. So then the Richmond Palladium a bit later said, oh, that's very interesting. Why do we have these franked letters right here from your congressional office sending out Solomon P. Chase campaign material? And at that point, George Julian you couldn't argue anymore. He had been thoroughly humiliated by this whole process. Yeah. But come 1850, April 4th, George Julian still won. This was in large part due to the Indiana's 5th District being a very radical Republican hotbed. It was known as the Burnt District because it had been said about the Democratic elements had been burnt out of it. The Democratic Party elements had been burnt out of it.
Yeah.
But at large, this mirrored what had occurred in the Republican Party, as ultimately the radical faction would triumph over the moderate faction. But Solomon Meredith, perhaps mirroring the determination of his former Iron Brigade soldiers, refused to give up the goose. He decided, well, actually, I think there was voter fraud in this primary, so I need to run as an independent candidate to try and set this record straight and win the congressional seat. And there were even some talks that the Democrats might withdraw their candidate and endorse Meredith, since they figured it would be better to have a moderate in the seat than Radical Julian. And that did not sit at all. Well, that did not sit well at all with the National Republican Party, to the point where Abraham Lincoln had to personally intervene to send. He personally intervened to say, David Holloway, who was the editor of the Richmond Palladium and also the commissioner of patents at the time, he threatened to remove him from office if he didn't convince Solomon Meredith to drop out of the congressional race and not wanting to lose his head. Holloway had a nice little sit down with Meredith and said, okay, I understand your pride is a bit bruised, I understand that you think you were cheated, but you really need to withdraw from this race for the good of the party, for the good of the Union." And Solomon Meredith, being, if nothing else, they were a good Union man, understood this argument. He withdrew, and George Julian ended up winning re-election. But this ended up not being the end of the story,
Huh?
because Solomon Meredith would be given a few more commands by the end of the war, but he was still unsatisfied with the whole affair. He still thought Julian had a bit of a stench about him. So, come 1865, in December 1865, George Julian was at a train station, and Solomon Meredith came up to him with a gang of about 6 to 8 other guys, and he claimed that George Julian had conspired to remove him from some of his later war commands. Now, George Julian did not really seem to have done this, but when he denied the charges, Solomon Meredith got so mad that he took out a horsewhip he had been carrying and proceeded to start beating
Oh
George
boy.
Julian to a bloody pulp. Like even the men Solomon Meredith had brought with him to protect him during this whole affair said, "Solomon Meredith, you've got to stop. You're really beating this guy. You're going to kill him." And George Solomon Meredith just kept going and going until eventually George Julian was left in a pool of blood on the ground. And Solomon Meredith just walked away, thought nothing would happen to it. George Julian perhaps miraculously survived this whole affair. And he, for, for unclear reasons, he did not decide to press charges against Solomon Meredith
Wow.
for, uh, for this whole fiasco. But it was a very brash, bloody conclusion to the whole Meredith Julian struggle for the future of the Republican Party.
Wow. It's interesting listening to this conflict because people sort of think of the Republican Party as kind of this monolithic, well-established party, and yes, particularly after Lincoln's assassination, there's a lot of tension between the radicals and the moderates, but like the Republican Party was not that old and it was still sort of figuring out what it was and getting its feet underneath it. Kind of you know the 1860 election gives it a reason to coalesce, but it's still sort of figuring itself out. And so this story really kind of reflects part of that identity crisis that the party's still going through.
It's very much a boots on the ground type story, because there's always the stories of the men in Congress, and normally you don't see these type of stories. Maybe a couple of them in the 1850s, such as Charles Sumner and the Henry Foote,
Right.
Thomas Hart Benton affair. But to see how politics worked on the ground during this time period, where it was a very muddy, bloody, fisticuffs type affair, where the fate of the Union is in one sense, being decided on the battlefields, but the fate of the Reconstruction is being decided in train stations between George Julian and Solomon Meredith and other train stations like that across the Union.
Yeah. Yeah. So what got you interested in this particular story? Because you've been working on this for a little bit now.
This story is just it seemed like the story that you would hear all about. This is everyone knows about Charles Sumner and Preston Brooks. This how Preston Brooks caned Charles Sumner, and this story seems like a very similar metaphor for how we could understand radical Republicans and moderate Republicans in the same way. It was very much a very George Julian Solomon Meredith primary battle was very much a microcosm for that struggle. And yet, I did not find in my own research any other people who had really broached this topic in depth. There are some people who had skimmed on it, like in the very good history of the 19th Indiana, Iron Men, Iron Will. They briefly talk about the topic, but they don't really dive into the party implications for what had occurred there or the whole campaign at large. So I thought this is a very good, very interesting story that I should dive into. I should try and find some more information to and try to relate to it and try to relate it to the bigger picture.
Hmm. Yeah, and I really like the way you talk about the rough and tumbleness of the politics in this story. That's kind of it feels very frontier like too, which I suppose once upon a time Indiana was, but it's a little more civilized by this point in its history
Yes.
than it was when Lincoln's out there as a young boy. Um, h- how would you characterize Lincoln's attention to Indiana during the war? Because eventually you say that he intervenes in this particular political case, but like, how much attention does Lincoln give Indiana?
Lincoln gave Indiana a fair amount of attention, in large part due to the constant pestering of Oliver P. Morton, who believed there was a copperhead ghost in every shadow and a copperhead skeleton in every closet. He would always pester Lincoln, saying, "Oh, you need to send more men to the state to prevent us from copperheads from taking over, or you need to send more men to the state to prevent Confederate raids from happening again." Where to be fair to Morton, there were raids, the Newburgh raid, Battle of Cordon, as we talked about, but at the same time, his sometimes his imagination probably got the better of him. There were undoubtedly copperheads, but was there a grand scale conspiracy? Probably not to the degree that Oliver P. Morton imagined.
It's funny, like, oh, send troops here. And Lincoln's probably like, no, send me your troops. Like, I need your guys for the battlefield. And, and did Lincoln have a particular attachment to Indiana? I mean, he grew up there, but, we tend to think of him as being born in Kentucky. Illinois is the land of Lincoln. And we jump over, kind of in popular memory tends to jump over Indiana as his boyhood home.
I don't particularly have any Lincoln, Indiana connections. Obviously, during his uh, train trip from Springfield to Washington D.C., he did make some stops in Indiana, make some speeches, but I don't know of any particularly strong connections he made to the state
Yeah,
during the war.
yeah, very good. So, as you get ready to wrap up your political story here, do you have anything on the horizon yet? I know that's a tough question to ask when you're busy trying to get this project over the finish line, but have you started looking to what you might want to be working on next?
Uh, there are some interesting possibilities. I do always have to keep my eye on the next project because once this one's done, there's probably going to be some other one. There's always the next project when you continue in these academic careers. But I have actually found that working on emerging civil war has been very good for sparking my interest in trying to come up with new ideas because emerging civil war they work in the form of short form articles, which is very good if you just want to dip your toes into considering a topic. But also, that kind of helps you to get your foot in the door
Hmm.
if you want to try some research something larger. There's a lot of ideas I've been considering. I've currently have been working on forming a database as part of an internship I've been performing with my history department. So
Okay.
maybe I can take the data I've compiled there, try and draw some conclusions from it via analysis. But for me, the future is very open. I'm very eager to see where my journey is going to continue, and I am always looking for the next good story to tell and write about.
Ah, you're a man after my own heart, that's for sure. I'm always on the lookout for that next great story too. So as we get ready to wrap up, first of all, anything I haven't asked you that I should have, anything that our listeners and readers need to know about you as they're getting familiar with you as an ECW contributor?
I think we have covered a very good some of the stories of Indiana. I'm just very passionate about the Civil War. As a Hoosier myself, I find very interesting the stories about Indiana. I try to explain them, and I do look forward to trying to continue to do more research on the Civil War, bring more stories to light, and continue as a historian through this journey one way or another.
Very good. So as we wrap up, then I'm going to put you totally on the spot here, and I'm going to ask you to hearken back to your early interest in the Rev War, so we can bring our conversation full circle. As we're heading into the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, America 250 underway now. Um, any lessons you think people should be kind of thinking of, or any direction you'd want them to kind of point their thoughts as we move through America 250?
Uh, what I remember, what I think about is what Benjamin Franklin allegedly said. Maybe he did, and maybe he did, as they were signing the Declaration. Oh, wait, yeah,
The Constitution?
the Declaration of
Okay,
Independence.
okay.
His famous line, "We must all hang together, or more sincerely, we all hang separately." I don't think there's any doubt that this is a bit of time of divisiveness, of conflict in our own country, And this is certainly not the first time our country has been divided, not the first time we've had conflict. But as we reflect on the experiences of our nation over 250 years, I would say that we should reflect on the things that hold us together, how we are greatest as a nation when we can come together and try and find our strengths and things that bind us. The better angels of our nature, to take a Lincoln line.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's great advice. That's great advice. I have to admit, I thought you were maybe going to evoke his comment after the Constitution got signed. And he says, "Well, now you've got your democracy if you can keep it, or your republic if you can keep it there."
Yes.
So, uh, uh, all right. Thanks so much for spending some time and sharing some stories from Hoosierland with us today. So,
Well, I really appreciate this opportunity to come and talk about them.
well, we really appreciate the chance to have you with us, and we look forward to more great work on the blog from you.
Yeah.
So. I'm Chris Bukowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. On behalf of my colleague, Arie DeYoung, thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.